Hello and welcome to another Deck Tech here at Lorcana University. Today we're covering what I'm calling Mama Hyper Ramp, this Amethyst Sapphire list that I've got for you. I asked online which legendary from Into the Inklands should I build around. I had hoped to do a series on deck building strategies leading up to this list, but unfortunately, time did not allow it. I'll have to try again for Ursula's Return. But when I asked this question, somebody said, hey, what would building around Gramma Tala, Spirit of the Ocean look like? So I set about doing that. So this 7 ink 4/8 that quests for 2 has Shift 5, which means you can overlay her for a cheaper cost on top of an existing Gramma Tala, of which we have a 2-drop. But she also has the ability, Do You Know Who You Are? Whenever a card is put into your inkwell, gain 1 lore. So this legendary draws a lot of parallels to the similar Grand Pabby from set 2. Both give you a lore for doing something Sapphire is good at. Gramma Tala's case, that's ramp. In Grand Pabby's, it was healing. But healing was a bit of a dead-end build-around. It doesn't really enable a whole lot of other mechanics, synergies, or strategies beyond challenging aggressively. Ramping, on the other hand, enables a lot of other mechanics. It just gives us a lot more resources to play bigger, powerful cards or more of those other synergies. The biggest problem for a ramp deck is being able to slow down fast decks that are questing for tons of lore out of the gate. I tried Ruby for a while, ramping towards Be Prepared and using Teeth and Ambition as well as Rush characters to beat up my opponent's characters, long enough to stall into the endgame, but found that my endgame draw power was lacking. I was really at the mercy of my top deck, needing to hit a removal, song, or action, but instead drawing a 1-jump ahead. After many iterations, I decided to switch Ruby control pieces out for Amethyst Bounce. My thoughts were that Amethyst Bounce cards are great at early game interaction, as proven by Ruby Amethyst's continual dominance. But also it falls back to the idea that playing 2 medium strength 4 ink characters allows a lot more flexibility than trying to play 1 8 ink powerful character. The only risk at choosing this path is running out of cards, which after a lot of testing has proven to not be an issue. So let's get into the list. First, we're going to talk about the endgame, naturally, the mamas. So Gramma Tala gains us lore for inking anything. This means she can generate lore the turn she's played, even when she isn't shifted into play. Pay 7 ink for her, then follow that up with some characters singing 1 jump ahead, inking cards from our hands, or even playing a Let It Go, choosing one of our characters to turn into ink if we need that game-winning 20th lore. This isn't particularly explosive, but it allows us to win races where our opponents are doing the math in their heads and aren't expecting us to magically add 1 to 3 lore to the amount we can quest for on our turn. The next Mama is my favorite card from Into the Inklands, and that is Mama Odie Mystical Maven. This 3 ink uninkable 1/3 quests for 1 and has the ability, this going to be good. Whenever you play a song, you may put the top card of your deck into your inkwell face down and exerted. This was originally just a Mickey Mouse detective in earlier versions of this list, but the fact that Mama Odie can ramp us multiple times, should we be able to sing a lot of songs, feels a lot stronger. Of course, it's a riskier character, as sometimes we won't have songs in our hands, but testing this shows that on average, they give us an extra 1 to 3 ink per Odie each game, as opposed to the safe 1 ink from a detective. These cards are also very good in the late game at feeding into that Gramma Tala, just giving us extra ink into our inkwell without having to spend cards out of our hand, devoted to just doing that, like A Friend in Me. I love this card and how it tags a 1 jump ahead to any song we sing. The ideal curve out is to play a turn 3 Mama Odie and then sing a 1 jump ahead with our turn 2 character, whether that have been a snake or a Gramma Tala. Mama Odie adds a second card off the top of our deck into our inkwell, in addition to 1 jump ahead's inked card. Then on the following turn, we use Mama Odie to sing a Friends on the Other Side, which will net us another ink into our inkwell and a bunch of cards to play with all said ink. At this point, she's already exceeded the ceiling for a Mickey Mouse detective and has potential for more. I think there's a very real risk, however, of building too much around Mama Odie. A lot of people are throwing various songs into the mix as to what to trigger her with, but one of the reasons I think this deck works very well is that we're not really straying from the core songs that are most powerful for the sake of Mama Odie. The core 3 songs, some of the most powerful in our colors, include 1 Jump Ahead, Friends on the Other Side, and Let It Go. You're probably going to see these songs whenever you play an Amethyst or Sapphire player, so we didn't have to really build around Mama Odie to justify her ability. There is one exception though. I've started to run It Calls Me, Overdevelop Your Brain. This cantrip song is slightly worse at digging for bombs when we have a dozen ink, but it has upside in that it can stifle decks that reuse their discards. Decks that use Perditas, Chernobygs, Do It Again, and others. And of course, the additional value here is that this is a song that can ramp us with Mama Odie. This is really the only card I've added to the list for the sake of Mama Odie, and it pushes her from being fairly good to great. Next, let's talk about the early game, which is important in a deck that devotes a lot of its plays to do-nothings, or actions, songs, and characters who don't either threaten to win the game or threaten to banish opposing characters. One of my favorite one-drops and Amethyst cards from set 3 is Chernobog's Followers. I really like that this card is a way to slow down aggro decks, but alternatively can be traded in for a card draw in other matchups where they find themselves less effective. I think of this as a character-based cantrip, and those are usually very valuable because they're card draw that have an opportunity to banish things. Also in this list is Rafiki, Mystical Fighter, which really helps take out things like bodyguards and some of the higher willpower early game threats like Madam M Snakes and Mr. B Bumbling Mates. Next we have the classic Amethyst Bounce package. This comes from set 2 as a powerful set of Madam Mim and Merlin characters who synergize insanely well together. The Madam Mim characters are overpowered, having more strength and willpower than other characters of their cost. But they have the drawback that you have to return another character to your hand to play them, effectively undoing one of your previous plays. This tempo loss of wasting ink by having to remove your own character from the board is easily offset by the Merlin characters who have abilities that give you advantages both when you first play them and when they leave play. This creates a recursive value engine that allows you to replay the same cards repeatedly, reaping their benefits over and over and over again throughout the match. Couple this with overpowered Madam Mim characters who can effectively threaten all early game characters, and we have a way to really slow down the match until we can reach 7+ ink and start pulling off some crazy plays. And those plays can be as simple as a lot more of the same. Being able to replay the same rabbit multiple times in the same turn means we're able to outvalue other Amethyst players simply because we're going to have a lot more ink than them. So let's talk about that endgame. The deck is meant to win with Gramma Tala, Spirit of the Ocean, but the great thing is that we don't really need to do much beyond what's already being done to do that. We either use our control elements to continue to stifle our opponent's plays, and simply ink a card each turn to generate extra lore. Or even better, we can get bonus ink from Mama Odie's when we continue to fire off songs like Let It Go or Friends on the Other Side, things we were probably going to do whether or not Mama Odie was in play. However, we still need to compete with some of the opposing bombs that come out in other decks. For that, we also run Hades, Infernal Schemer, and Dr. Facilier, Agent Provocateur. Hades needs no introduction. He's the best blue bomb out there right now, I'm sorry Tamatoa, and gets extra value in this deck because we can bounce him to our hand with a snake to immediately replay and ink another opposing character. Dr. Facilier is my king of bounce, being the top end of the Madam Mim Merlin bounce parade. Originally this was a Madam Mim Purple Dragon, which I loved trying to win with that card, but almost every game that I played the dragon, I went from dominating to quickly losing. And this usually came from bouncing my dominant board state to my hand so that I can then replay some of them the following turn, only to have my opponent seize that opportunity to play a whole new world, resulting in me discarding a bunch of powerful cards that I have sculpted and then drawing a bunch of random mediocre ones, losing my ability to bounce the cards that I had in play. So I reluctantly swapped out the Purple Dragon for this Purple Voodoo Priest, and I've enjoyed it ever since. His ability to bring characters banished in challenges back to your hand really synergizes well with the Madam Mim and Merlin package, all characters that either are aggressive challengers or generate us extra value when banished. I also have 2 slots set aside for some experimental endgame cards, ones that really help us push to 20 lore rather than dirtling or making a lot of plays that don't amount to any significant change to the board state. Previously these were Merlin Goats, but I'm really interested in testing the Queen's Castle Mirror Chamber more and more. I like that it has such a large threat that it lures our opponents into challenging with many of their characters, which allows us to batter them with our Madam Mim characters on the crackback. I think this is great for breaking stalemates, whereas a Goat was more of the same, not very effective if our opponent is holding back, not exerting their characters. Next, let's talk about ramp. For a ramp deck, you'd expect this category to be full to the brim with stuff, but I found that I can run as little as 1 Jump Ahead, Mama Odie Mystical Maven, and Gramma Tala Storyteller, and still end up with 11+ ink each and every game. And this is because Mama Odie triggers multiple times throughout the match and flies under everyone's radar until it's way too late. There are plenty of other options for ramping out there, but I fell in love with Mama Odie because she doesn't remove cards from her hand to ink, which is a severe card disadvantage. And she makes singing feel even more powerful. I used to run Mickey Mouse Detective, who has a higher floor and that he will always guarantee you at least 1 ink without requiring a song, and can be bounced and replayed with Madam Mims, but I never felt great at devoting these bounces to ramp when I could be using them to draw cards with Merlin Rabbits or pump with Merlin Crabs. One of the greatest weaknesses of a ramp heavy list is card disadvantage. When the most important things in the game are questing to 20 lore or preventing your opponent from questing to 20 lore, cards like 1 Jump Ahead don't directly control contribute to either of those goals. They require other cards to do so. So playing this card can be considered card disadvantage. You used up one of the precious few cards in your hand, but didn't directly influence either of those two goals. It gets even worse with things like Fishbone Quill, which not only themselves don't contribute directly to questing or challenging, but also ask you to sacrifice other cards in your hand by turning them into ink. These severe card disadvantages have to be offset by copious amounts of card draw, or you'll find yourself without a hand, having played a ton of Lorcana and yet you have no characters in play and no lore, while your opponent is skipping to 20 with ease. So the final category is card draw, which we have extras to offset the card disadvantage of one jump ahead, and characters that aren't really great like Gramma Tala. As I mentioned before, Chernobog's followers are like a delayed cantrip, allowing you to cash them in for a new card in the late game when they're no longer relevant. I also mentioned before the power of Merlin Rabbit, which often can net us 2 to 4 cards in a single game with our bounce effects. Also rounding out the team is Maleficent Sorceress and Gramma Tala, Keeper of Ancient Stories, which I'm liking more and more for her larger strength and willpower stats, coupled with her Develop Your Brain ability. Lastly, I mentioned several of the other cards, including Mama Odie triggering songs like It Calls Me, Friends on the Other Side, and also the Queen's Castle Mirror Chamber, which is more of a reckless effect than a card draw. We use it to force our opponents to exert their characters so they can knock it out, and then we can knock them out. But if it actually draws us cards, even better. It's a good use of extra ink by moving characters there. So there you have it, a Gramma Tala build-around list. I actually like this list quite a lot, and it performs very well. Likely one of the strongest ones I've brewed to date. I've put this in the B+ to A- tier, as it can beat up Ruby Amethyst control if played right. The only consistent losses I sustained while testing this deck were, ironically, against Steel when it plays a whole new world. This is because you can sculpt a really nasty hand of powerful options bounced from play, like rabbits, Hades, and crabs, all kinds of great things in your hand, putting your opponent in a really tough spot. But then they make you discard that powerful hand, and you end up drawing a bunch of weird stuff, like ramp cards, more Odies. You're running out of characters that can bounce the ones you have in play. Then you need to spend a turn or two drawing cards, trying to rebuild that bounce house again, while your opponent might just be playing big bombs like Cinderella Stouthearted and Robin Hood Champion of Sherwood. But building this deck was a ton of fun. Let me know what you think about this list, and what you might swap out for your meta. I've actually already recorded a gameplay of this and released that, so if you want to see it in action, be sure to check that out. Once again, sorry to all those who are hoping for a deck building primer. I'm going to try again for Ursula's return now that I'm getting a bit more consistent with my content production. Hope you enjoyed the list. For more Lorcana content, like and follow Lorcana University.